Writing Out Loud, a program designed to explore in-depth interviews with writers to hear that words have voices. Our hostess for today's program is Teresa Miller, Executive Director for the Oklahoma Center for Poets and Writers at OSU Tulsa.
Hello everyone, I'm Teresa Miller and welcome to Writing Out Loud. My very, very special guest today is Suzanne Mars, the author of Eudora Welty, a biography. Wow. She's one of my favorite writers.
That's my favorite.
Well, listen, how overwhelming was it to sit down and write on the title page, Eudora Welty, a biography? I think you must have felt like Karen Armstrong when she sat down and wrote The History of God. You know, you're talking about one of America's most beloved writers.
Well, it was a labor of love. I knew Eudora very well, and I really wanted to do a good job, so it was intimidating because I was my own harshest critic. But the title, I never sat down and wrote Eudora Welty, a biography. For many months, I didn't write that. We debated on all sorts of titles, and my editor finally said, let's go with the simple one. And so we went with Eudora Welty, a biography.
How did you first meet Eudora?
I had been reading her fiction and had published a couple of short, maybe more than that, several short essays about it. And then I wrote to her and said, may I come and interview you? I'm working on an essay about losing battles. And I never had a response. So I came to Jackson anyway to use the...
You're stubborn.
Right. I went to use the archives, and when I was there at the Mississippi Archives, I asked one of the archivists, could you arrange for me to meet Miss Welty? And he said, well, let's ask Miss Capers. Miss Capers was Eudora's old friend. Yeah. And she came up and sort of checked me out and said, well, I think Eudora ought to meet you. And so we did meet, and later Charlotte told me, she said, you know, Eudora will take a shine to the strangest people. So there you are. I'm glad
you became quite close, didn't you?
We did. We were very good friends.
And she gave you access to her personal correspondence. Did you ever feel, because you were a friend, that you were intruding in any way?
There were things I found at first that I thought I was a little sensitive about revealing. But Eudora had given me access to the correspondence, and the correspondence was going to be open to the public eventually because she had left it in her will to the state of Mississippi. So I really didn't feel that kind of compunction. I did love reading it. It was just fascinating to read the correspondence, and then there was far more than I would ever have dreamed, far more letters.
Since you knew her so well to begin with, did you have to, as a biographer, sort of reacquaint yourself with her to be a little more objective as you studied these letters?
I think that's right. I felt that she would want me to be objective as it's possible to be. Of course, objectivity is a pretty elusive goal, but I was striving for objectivity and distance. As I was working.
Now, did she know you were actually writing this biography of her?
Yes, she gave me her permission to do it. I wouldn't have started without the permission.
How did you come to that point when, you know, you're talking to this great writer and finally you two decide that you're going to do her biography?
Well, I didn't want to ask her. And,
yeah, because that was a hard question to kind of bring up.
And I was reconciled. I had wanted to do it, but I just was reconciled to not doing it because she'd been opposed to biography. And finally, my fiance kept saying, you need to do it. And Reynolds Price was visiting, and Roanne said to Reynolds, don't you think Suzanne ought to ask Eudora about this? And Reynolds said, yes, by all means ask her. So I asked her, and you could have knocked me over when she said yes.
Wow. Well, there was another biography written of her some years ago. Anne Waldron wrote it. What are the limitations of that biography?
Well, Anne Waldron didn't have access to the 15,000 letters that I had access to.
Which is huge,
right?
huge.
Nor did she have access to the manuscripts that Eudora was working on late in her life. And those were very useful as well. And then, of course, Eudora's friends, Eudora had asked her friends not to speak with Anne Waldron. She didn't, at that point, want a biography. And so she didn't really have access to a good many of most of Eudora's friends refused to be interviewed. So I didn't have any of those problems.
Yeah. Why do you think initially she didn't want a biography written about her? Was it because she's so modest or so private?
I think it's the privacy. I think she felt always that her fiction spoke for itself, and that it wasn't necessary to cast it in an autobiographical light or a biographical light. She did write her brief autobiography, One Writer's Beginnings, in an attempt to sort of forestall biography.
Right.
Here's what needs to be told. But then she really was backing away from that resistance before she gave me permission. When Tom Nolan was working on a biography of Ross MacDonald, Kenneth Miller, Reynolds Price was going to be interviewed, and he called Eudora and said, "May I speak about your relationship with Ken to the biographer?" And Eudora said yes. So.
What are some of the most common misconceptions about Welty? Because she was private and there wasn't a lot of information out there. Our imaginations went to work.
I think there are three major misconceptions. One is that she was essentially a very provincial person, that she lived all her life in Jackson, Mississippi, that she did drive herself in her Olds Cutlass 4 on the floor to the Jitney Jungle grocery store, but then she'd come back home, go upstairs and write her stories, and she never knew the wider world. But in fact, she was a very cosmopolitan person, tremendously cosmopolitan person, and very well-traveled person. In 1937, she and John Robinson and his brother Will and their sister Annabelle Robinson, 4 friends, drove by themselves to Mexico, pretty primitive roads. She went to school, of course, at Madison, Wisconsin, and at Columbia University in New York. She went by herself to Europe in 1949. She went to New York almost every year. She lived for several months, an extended period in San Francisco. So she was very cosmopolitan. And when she was in Europe, she lived in sort of left bank, fairly in Paris, bohemian sort of environment, but she also socialized with Lady Harvey, the wife of the British ambassador to France, and met Bernard Berenson in Italy, and so a very cosmopolitan person.
Yeah, the other misconception.
A second would be that she was apolitical, and she was very much interested in politics. Your friend Jim Lehrer was one of her favorite newsmen, and she and I used to watch the McNeil Lehrer News Hour almost every night, and we were always talking politics. She only campaigned for one presidential candidate, that was Adlai Stevenson, but she had William Winter was our fine governor of Mississippi. She had a William Winter bumper sticker on her car. Wherever that car is, it still has a William Winter bumper sticker. She took some important stands during the Civil Rights Movement. I was
going to ask you about that because some people have criticized her for not taking strong enough stands.
She wasn't a person who went out and marched through the streets or took to the public platform. But at Millsaps College, for instance, where I teach, in 1963, Millsaps officials came to Eudora Welty and said, you're going to be speaking here. A group from Tougaloo College, which is a local African-American institution, are probably going to try to integrate your reading. We think it should be closed. And she said, absolutely not. It should be open to everyone. She spoke at Tougaloo College. And the people there really did see her as a person who did not tolerate prejudice in her personal life, and who embodied the kind of stance they wished everyone would take.
She just expressed it in a little different way.
In a different way, through her work as well. She did write a hot letter to the editor one time that I found, and that was in right after World War II, and a local group had Gerald L.K. Smith, who was a nationalist candidate and a really rabid anti-Semitic candidate, to speak. And Eudora wrote to the Clarion Ledger, our local newspaper, and said, Smith needs to get out and stay out of Mississippi. And then she said, and we also need to get Bilbo and Rankin out too, two of our local demagogues of the time. So she could speak out publicly in a letter to the editor, but more typical would be her expressing herself in fiction.
Third misconception.
Third misconception, I think, is that she is the proverbial spinster,
Yeah.
that she had never known love. But in fact, she was loved, and she loved two rather remarkable men over the course of her life. One was from Jackson, Mississippi, a man named John Robinson,
Mm-hmm.
and the other was Kenneth Miller, whose pen name was Ross MacDonald. And that was a relationship that developed late in her life, and I'm not suggesting it was an affair, but it was a very profound, loving friendship. They were in love with each other, I do believe. Yes.
And she found out that this first gentleman was gay.
Yes.
And that there was just no way that they could be together. But she came to accept that.
And she accepted it, and they were friends until his death. So, yes, she came to terms with that. It was a grave disappointment, but she came to terms with it. And then, of course, she respected Kenneth Miller's marriage as he did, but they carried on a wonderful correspondence, writing to each other about, twice a month for more than 10 years, each of them sending 2 letters a month. And wonderful letters, philosophical, literary, personal.
And weren't they very supportive of each other's work?
They were. They were great admirers. Eudora had written a review of a Kenneth Miller novel, and he wrote to thank her for the review, and he later dedicated a book to her, Sleeping Beauty, and she dedicated her book of critical essays to him, The Eye of the Storm.
I was wondering, as we look at their relationship, what do you think was it about their relationship that just kept them going, even when his illness took over, and she really couldn't hear back from him in the way she was accustomed to?
Yes, Alzheimer's claimed him, and that was a particular horror for Eudora. I think memory was such an important thing to her. She said memory is the treasure most dearly regarded in her life and in her work. And she felt that was true of Kenneth Miller, too, and then for him to be bereft of his memory.
Yes, and then she didn't feel free to visit with him because of his marriage and to share with him that time.
She would like to have been more supportive of him, but because of his wife wouldn't have welcomed constant visits from Eudora Welty, I think that wasn't possible. And but she did try to be as supportive as she could through the correspondence. But it was sad not to hear back. She was used to hearing back.
I'm sure it was for her. Did she speak openly with you about these relationships, or did you discover them in the letters?
I discovered them in the letters. I knew that these were close relationships, but I did not know the extent of it. Reynolds Price had told me. But Eudora, I think, did not really feel comfortable talking about those relationships with me, maybe because I was so much younger.
Could be a good point. In addition to the letters, what other kind of research did you do?
Well, of course, I knew her work intimately. I did interviews with many of her friends. William J. Smith, the poet William J. Smith, was very important to me. He gave me some days and days of interviews. I went up to his Massachusetts home and talked to him. Reynolds Price spent a long time with me. I interviewed him. Other friends of Eudora's. Then I had manuscripts. I had a manuscript that Eudora wrote when she was 15 or 16, and rather autobiographical in nature about a young girl in Jackson, Mississippi growing up.
Yeah.
And I had manuscripts from her late in life where she was trying to work out, write about Kenneth Miller's Alzheimer's, and was struggling to find the kind of distance from that material that she needed. I had as well, I told you 15,000 letters. Many from Eudora, many to her. I had both sides of a lot of correspondences, which was really valuable.
You mentioned that these two relationships, the depth of them anyway, were surprises to you. Any other surprises?
Well, the one Eudora I felt I didn't know. I knew the adult Eudora Welty, but I didn't think I knew the young woman, the college student, the kind of brash, very self-consciously trying to be humorous person. You know, Eudora was tremendously funny, but it always just seemed to emerge naturally. But as a young woman, much more self-conscious about humor, I thought. And that was the person I didn't know. I was glad to meet her.
I want to dip back just a moment to the autobiography she wrote, the memoir, One Writer's Beginnings. How revealing was that? I mean, on one level, you could say it's pretty revealing because she talks about her craft, which was very intimate to her, but really nothing about her personal life.
Well, I think she does talk about her relationship with her mother in a very moving way, and I think she reveals some of the tensions, the love and the tension that were in that relationship. But about her adult life, no. She didn't talk about John Robinson or Kenneth Miller. She didn't talk about Reynolds Price, who she met as a student and whose career was so important to her. So
he was almost like a son to her.
He was,
wasn't he?
yes. So those things were not there, and I think it took her a long time to sort of recognize that there's going to be a biography, and the best thing is to make the materials available, and they will all be available for research.
Yeah, she wrote during a time when Southern writing was flourishing, and Catherine Ann Porter was a mentor to her. How big an influence was Catherine Ann Porter?
I don't think she was an influence in terms of Eudora Welty style, in terms of her craft especially, but she was a great champion of her work, and she tried to help her find a publisher. She sent, she wrote to Ford Maddox Ford on Eudora Welty's behalf, and he then wrote, and Eudora sent him a book of stories, a manuscript of stories, which he tried to place. Catherine Ann Porter was married to Albert Erskine at the Southern Review, and she enlisted Albert Erskine's help for Eudora Welty. She got Eudora Welty invited to Yaddo, the artist colony in upstate New York. So she wrote the introduction for her first book, which was, you know, very useful to have an introduction by Catherine.
Yeah, veteran writer.
But I don't think she influenced the course of her writing. I think the influence was more helping her career, but not influencing the work.
Very, very important distinction. Two contemporaries of Eudora, two Southern women writers, Carson McCullers, Flannery O'Connor. Did Eudora know them? What did she think of their work?
She knew both of them. I don't think she admired Flannery. She did admire Flannery O'Connor's work. I don't think she admired Carson McCullers' work nearly as well.
Interesting, because they're both from Mississippi.
No, Carson McCullers is Georgia.
Georgia, that's right.
She and Flannery O'Connor, I think, were sort of mystified by each other's work. They admired each other, and they recognized the genius that each recognized the genius in the other. But Eudora Welty told me that she was teaching a Flannery O'Connor story when she was teaching briefly when her mother was ill. But she said, "But you know, I didn't understand it." and they really are very different stories. She actually heard Flannery O'Connor give the speech where Flannery O'Connor said about Southern writers, you know, you better get off the track if you see the Dixie Limited coming, the Dixie Limited being William Faulkner.
Did Welty feel it all overshadowed by Faulkner?
No, she really liked Faulkner. She loved his work. She admired him tremendously, and I don't think she thought of writers as being in competition, and she wasn't concerned about your relative status. She just was a great admirer of William Faulkner's. She met him 2 or 3 times.
Yeah, and didn't they get along pretty well?
They did. They got along really well. He took her sailing. After one dinner party, they all sat around singing hymns. I'd like to hear William Faulkner and Eudora Welty singing hymns.
Well, too bad that wasn't recorded, yeah.
She said that Faulkner had a kind of sadness about him that she sensed, and she thought he was, a very engaging individual.
Do you think that the fact that she was female, though, kept her from getting the kind of recognition she would have gotten as a writer if she had been male? Now, naturally, she did get a lot of recognition, particularly in her latter years, but early on.
Well, I think she did manage to be published in book form pretty rapidly, because her first story came out in 1936 and then her first book in 1941. And she had an agent named Dermot Russell, who was the son of A.E., George William Russell, who adored her work and who pushed her work and placed it in very good magazines, and then secured the book publication for her. And she had editors who really admired her work. I don't know if being a woman kept her from coming to the fore. Eventually, of course, she did. I mean, she was the first writer to be published, living writer to be published by the Library of America, for instance. So.
And she seems to be held in higher regard just year after year.
I think so, yes.
You know, as one of the writers, I think will certainly be remembered as one of the great writers of the 20th century. We talked about Catherine Ann Porter, perhaps mentoring her to a degree. Did Eudora in turn mentor other young writers?
She tried to help young writers whenever she could. She went in 1955 to Duke University and talked to William Blackburn's fiction writing class, and a young student in that class was Reynolds Price, and she read his story, and so then she put him in touch with her agent. They carried on a correspondence. He would send her manuscripts. So she really did try to advance his career. I think Elizabeth Spencer, another wonderful Mississippi writer, she again would try to help by putting her in touch with her agent, putting Elizabeth in touch with Dermot Russell, Eudora's agent, Ellen Douglas. I think, I don't know that she had much to do with Ann Tyler's career, but she certainly admired Ann Tyler.
A big fan, wasn't she?
And would give quotes to books by lots of people.
I remember interviewing Kay Gibbons, and Kay Gibbons had established a relationship with her. She did,
and Kay Gibbons, Eudora read Ellen Foster. Eudora Welty was a good friend of Lewis Rubin, who was Kay Gibbons' mentor, and Lewis said, you know, you need to read this book, and so I think she gave a quote for Ellen Foster.
Oh, she did?
Yeah, I was very supportive of Kay Gibbons. Clyde Edgerton says that, you know, Eudora Welty was really an inspiration for his career. When he read Why I Live at the P.O., that was one of the start of his.
Well, it's a wonderful, wonderful story. When you think about Eudora Welty, and Jim Lehrer, when he was on the show, said that when he thinks of Eudora, he thinks that's the first genius he was ever on just a personal, intimate basis with. What do you think were her outstanding characteristics as a writer?
As a writer, well, I was going to say, she, as I would say, along with Jim, that you knew when you were with Eudora Welty, you knew you were in the presence of a genius. She never said anything to, you know, I am a genius. And quite the contrary, she was very self-effacing, very interested in you, drawing you out. But whatever you wanted to talk about, she had something incisive to say. And she had read so voraciously all her life. She was very knowledgeable. As a writer, I love the way she can deal with issues which are crucial to our lives, with issues of love and death, and can do so in a complex fashion, not simplifying, but coming to terms with the urgency that our mortality brings to our lives, with the stresses that loving someone and the tensions that loving someone brings into your life, the great virtue of that love, but also the difficulties that arise because you love. I like the way she deals with the social scene of the South and of the nation. I love the variety of styles in her work. She can range from the most colloquial to the most poetic. I like the way she can structure the stories so intricately. A novel like Losing Battles, which has a tightly knit structure that you might associate with a lyric poem, but it's in a 400-page novel. So.
And she was also a good nonfiction writer.
Oh, yeah, very good essayist.
Yeah, an understanding of literature.
She always called herself an appreciator rather than a critic, but I think she had a very, you know, she understood the writing process, and she saw clearly and could explain clearly what the works of writers that she admired.
You say she's self-effacing. At the same time, she had to have a sense, or at least I hope she did, of the depth of her talent.
I think she did, and I think she wouldn't have left her papers to the archive. She was encouraged to, but I think she recognized the quality of her work, and she wasn't vainglorious about it. But but it was important to her, and I think she saw its significance.
If you, as her biographer, would have to pick what you consider the quintessential Eudora Welty pieces to be put in an anthology, what would they be?
The ones that are not in anthologies are my favorite stories. My favorite stories are the stories of the Golden Apples. It's a collection of interrelated short stories taking a small town, Morgana, Mississippi, from the turn of the century up to just past World War II. And the characters who are major characters in one story may be minor characters in another story. The image patterns of one story carry on into other stories. But she didn't have to come to the kind of conclusion that you might have in a novel, the kind of continuity you expect in a novel. So she wanted those breaks. And I love those stories, but they can be read separately. So I'd like to see June Recital anthologized or The Wanderers anthologized.
Did you ever get a sense from her in your conversations or from her correspondence what she considered her very best work?
I think she was very fond of The Optimist's Daughter. It was probably the most autobiographical of her works. It deals with her mother, and that it won a Pulitzer Prize, and that was very important to her. But I think The Golden Apples was also one that she thought might have been the sort of best of her works. When on my 40th birthday, Eudora Welty and I were driving to a party that some friends were going to give me, and I said to her, Eudora, I'm 40 years old. I haven't done anything. When you were 40, you published The Golden Apples. And she said, at 40, I felt like someone who could write The Golden Apples. I had come to that kind of maturity in my writing life, and I always loved that.
We just have 30 seconds here. Quick question for you. You've had wonderful conversations with Eudora. If you could go back and ask her one last question, what would it be?
Oh, gee, I don't know. I might ask about her relationships with John Robinson and Kenneth Miller, but then I might not, because I'm a little shy about asking that.
It's been a delight visiting with you, Suzanne.
Thank you.
Congratulations on this wonderful biography, and really a tribute to your friend and one of America's great writers. And thanks all of you for joining us on Writing Out Loud.